Have you ever felt completely alone, only to realize someone or something was watching you the entire time? This is the story of the nights I came face to face with fear I'll never forget. I remember this night like it was yesterday. Even though I'm 26 now, and it happened when I was 12 that my parents left me home for the night with my 18-year-old brother, Zach, at IT first. I was excited that IT was just me in the big house, which felt like huge freedom at the time. Zach told me he was going out with friends for a few hours. He made me promise not to tell Mom and Dad that I agreed that I trusted him. And honestly, why wouldn't I want the place to myself? If my parents found out, he'd be in huge trouble, and he knew I'd at IT first. Being alone felt fun. It was a weekend night that I ended up in the den and decided to watch a scary movie. Home Alone at that age. Not the best idea that I learned that. The hard way. I'd never been home alone for that long before, especially not at night. Halfway through the movie, I started getting scared. Not just because of the movie, but because of the house. The random creaks in the floor, the wind brushing against the windows, the fridge clicking on over and over again. Every time the movie made a loud sound, I flinched. I kept looking over my shoulder, toward the half flight of stairs behind the couch, expecting to see someone standing there. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know why I was doing this to myself. I shut off the TV and ran upstairs to my room, like a scared little kid running from imaginary demons that follow you the second you turn off the lights. When I got to my room, I went into the bathroom that connected my room and my parents' bedroom. I brushed my teeth as fast as I could, trying to calm down. Then I went back to my room and played Call of Duty Zombies on my Xbox 360. I thought it would make me feel less scared. I played for hours, lost track of time, focused only on the game. Eventually, we died. I got frustrated. IT was late. I decided to go to sleep. Not long after, I felt the vibration of the front door closing. I assumed it was Zach coming home. I lay there awake, listening to the sounds of someone moving around downstairs. That was odd. Usually, when Zach came home, he went straight upstairs. But this time, the sounds downstairs went on too long. Subtle footsteps, indescribable thumps, soft thuds. My stomach started churning. Watching that scary movie was really getting to me. I got up and went to the window. I expected to see Zach's car in the driveway. IT wasn't there. That's when the real panic set in. I didn't have a cell phone. I was 12. The only way to contact anyone was to leave my room and go to one of the house phones. That felt impossible. I tiptoed to my bedroom door and checked the lock. I knew it could be unlocked from the outside with just a fingernail, but if someone wanted in, they could get in. I looked around my room. The only place to hide was the small crawl-in closet built into the wall. I squeezed inside, carefully shut the door, and listened. I remember hoping desperately that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was Zach. Maybe he parked somewhere else. Seconds later, someone fumbled with my door. Then, the door opened. Someone was inside my room. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted. I stayed completely still. I listened to footsteps moving around my room. The floorboards creaked under their weight. I heard things being shifted, moved. Every second felt like an eternity. I was terrified the closet door would open and I would die. I prayed it was my brother, but I didn't move. I barely breathed. At one point, I heard something being dragged across the floor. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I stayed hidden for what felt like forever, probably 2 hours. Then, I heard Zach calling my name. His voice sounded angry, urgent. He came into my room and yelled again. I stepped out of the closet. The first thing he did was yell at me. He asked what I was doing and what I had done to his room. That was the moment I knew it wasn't him. I explained everything, shaking my hands, trembling uncontrollably. Once he understood, we searched the house together. That's when we saw how bad it was. Drawers pulled out, electronics missing. TVs, gaming consoles. Someone had been through our house. Zach called the police immediately. We waited together, on edge, checking every door and window. The police came. They took a report, asked questions, told us to wait for our parents. Around 4 a.m. Our parents came home. My dad went straight for Zach. Furious, he smacked him across the face for leaving me alone and leaving the front door unlocked. My mom hugged me. She said she was just glad I was safe. Zach had to pay back everything that was stolen. He was treated very differently after that night. I wasn't punished. I was just shaken, terrified. That fear stayed with me for years. Every time I thought about it, I felt it all again. Hiding in that closet, listening to someone walk around my room, not knowing if I would survive. It was the scariest experience of my life, and it still stays with me. When I was just a child, not even in kindergarten, I lived with my grandparents. My mom and dad had just separated, and my dad worked in the next town over, so I saw him every weekend. My uncle, my dad's brother, also lived with us, so I was rarely ever truly alone. I was always told to never answer the door for strangers. It was a small, peaceful town where everyone knew each other. We had a neighbor who visited often to watch hockey, wrestling, or join family barbecues. I'll call him David. He was friendly with both my grandpa and my uncle. He often drank beers with my uncle and helped my grandpa with yard work or truck repairs. If my grandpa came home with a moose from hunting, he and David would haul it into the shed together. One night, I was briefly left home alone. My grandma was at bingo, and I'd called for a pickup. My grandpa told me he was going to get her and asked if I wanted to come. I refused because I was watching cartoons. He reminded me not to open the door for strangers. Then he left. As soon as I saw the truck pull away, the house got quiet. Only a few minutes later, someone knocked at the door. I ran up and asked out loud who it was, and I just heard David's familiar voice identifying himself. I told him that my grandparents weren't home, and he replied that he had just seen my grandpa leaving. I told him my uncle wasn't home either, and he said he had been talking to my uncle on the phone and knew he was out drinking at a friend's place. Then he asked to come in. I told him I wasn't allowed to open the door for strangers, and he insisted he wasn't a stranger since he was our neighbor and someone I already know. In my child mind, he was right, but I didn't understand why he would come over when my grandpa and uncle weren't there. I unlocked the door and opened it. David towered over me. He was obviously drunk, swaying, slurring, squinting with one eye. He stepped inside and put his hands on my shoulders as I backed up. I didn't feel alarmed yet because I had seen my uncle drunk many times. I told him he could wait in the kitchen while I went back to watch TV, but he would not let go of my shoulders that I tried to pull his hands off of me, but couldn't. His voice changed, filled with anger, and he said things that frightened me, though I can't remember the exact words now, only the fear that they put in me. He dragged me into the kitchen and grabbed a large knife. He pressed the tip against my belly and asked if I wanted to be stabbed. When I cried, he told me to quiet down or he would cut my tongue or my throat. He dragged the dull side of the blade across my throat to show he was serious. Then I heard my grandparents' truck pulling in. Car doors closed outside. Relief flooded me, and I was about to scream for help, but David clamped his hand over my mouth. He turned us both toward the doorway just as my grandma entered. Her smile vanished when she saw him holding me with a knife. She screamed for my grandpa to get inside immediately. My grandpa rushed in, yelling in shock and fury as he demanded to know what was happening. He took one look at David holding me hostage and charged forward, shouting at David with pure rage. David shoved me to the floor. My grandma rushed over, grabbed me tightly, and blocked me from seeing what was happening while telling me I was safe. I could still hear the struggle. Eventually, my grandpa overpowered him. When I finally looked up, my grandpa was shoving David out the door, yelling at him to never come back, and then slamming the door. Yes, I grew up. I realized David had waited deliberately. He must have known my uncle wasn't home and that my grandma was at bingo. He had seen my grandpa leave. That was his moment. I was too young to understand his intentions. Years later, after my grandpa's funeral, when I was sitting with my grandma discussing memories, I brought up that night and how heroic Grandpa had been. She looked uneasy. She said it was truly a terrifying night. She asked if I remembered that my grandpa went out hunting that same night. I faintly remembered him leaving, even though hunting at night wasn't something he usually did, unless it involved camping. When I asked why he left, she claimed she didn't remember much. It got me thinking. They never called the cops to press charges on him, and I never saw him again after that night. My grandpa was respected in the community. He was friends with, as well as went to the same church as some police officers, and was known to be a good hunter. No one would ever question if they saw a bloody tarp in the back of his truck and he was driving out of town late at night. This story happened a few years ago during spring break in 2020 when I was 15. I was home alone one night while my parents were out of town. I was just hanging out in my room when I got a call from one of my mutual friends from school who I'll refer to as Mason. I don't usually get calls from Mason, let alone texts or keep in touch with him, but I answered anyway. Before I could get a word out, he asked what I was doing. I told him I was just at home and wasn't up to anything. He then asked if he could drop off one of my buddies because he needed a place to stay for the night. This buddy of mine is someone I've known since 3rd grade, who I'll refer to as Neil. I basically told him I didn't feel like having company over and just wanted to chill by myself. After hearing this, Mason practically begged me to let Neil stay at my house. I could sense desperation in his voice as he pleaded with me to let him drop Neil off. I was still reluctant at first, but then Mason told me he'd let me use his weed pen if I let him drop off Neil. After he said that, I caved and told him they could pull up. Looking back, I realized how dumb I was to let something like that persuade me, considering what happened next. But I was a stupid pothead at the time. So what can you do? Neil has always been very outgoing, almost with zero filter, and he doesn't care what others think about him. So when I heard from my brother and other friends the week prior that he had started acting really weird in his classes, I didn't think much of it at first. I asked my brother to elaborate, and he told me that Neil would sometimes start laughing or clapping out of nowhere, even if the classroom was completely silent, and he would sometimes say very strange things to people for no reason, like claiming the basketball coaches were Freemasons trying to convert him. After hearing this, I realized Neil wasn't acting normal. And it wasn't until he and Mason arrived at my house that I understood how bad it really was. I met Mason and Neil at my front door and greeted them like any other day. I hit Mason's weed pen as promised and gave it back. As Mason was about to leave, he grabbed Neil by the shoulders in a very serious way, tears forming in his eyes, and he pleaded with him not to do that thing. Neil looked at him blankly and casually responded that he understood. I really should have asked what was going on, but for some reason I didn't, and I let Neil inside as Mason left. After I closed the front door, the first thing Neil asked me was whether all the doors in the house were locked. Red flags immediately went off in my head, and I knew I had just gotten into something bad. I told him they were locked and asked why. He asked me to check, so I led him down the narrow hallway by the front door to show that the back and laundry room doors were both locked. He didn't say anything after I confirmed it, and we stood in silence for a few seconds. Then, out of nowhere, his hand shot up like he was raising it, and he put on this eerie, toothy smile that I can still see clearly in my mind. He held it for a few seconds before lowering his arm, without saying a word. I forced a fake chuckle to make the situation seem less weird. Then Neil asked for some water, so we went to the kitchen. As I grabbed bottles from the fridge, I noticed him lingering by the drawer with silverware, including the knives. I watched as he slowly opened the drawer and reached for a steak knife. Without thinking, I ran over, grabbed his hand before he could take it, and slammed the drawer shut. Neil didn't react or move. He just stared at me and let out a chuckle like he was pretending it was a joke that ate that moment. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, and I was frozen in fear, the kind of fear people describe in life or death situations. I had never felt like my life was in danger until that moment, and I could only focus on how I was going to get Neil out of my house. He finally broke the silence by suggesting we go to the park in the neighborhood. I agreed as if nothing happened. We walked to the laundry room leading to the driveway, and I intentionally let him out first. I told him I needed to put shoes on, which I did. He paused and subtly looked disappointed, telling me to hurry up. I shut the door, locked it immediately, and called my brother to explain what had just happened. After finishing the call, I grabbed every knife in the kitchen and brought them upstairs to my room. Keep in mind, I was stoned at the time, so my decision-making wasn't perfect, but I knew I needed to prevent Neil from forcing his way back into the house. My brother arrived with 3 friends in less than 5 minutes, and they met Neil outside. I stayed inside for a few minutes nervous, then went out. My brother and friends were talking to Neil, who was rambling about the school's basketball coaches being in the Illuminati and claiming they would sexually assault the boys on the team to make them play better. He continued talking nonsense for a few minutes. Then, we decided to get him home because there was no way I was letting him stay under my roof after what had happened. One of my friends eventually took Neil home, even though he insisted he couldn't go because he believed his dad was going to kill him. After all of this, I called Mason to ask what Neil had said to him that made him act that way. Mason explained that during the car ride, Neil had been reading a manifesto claiming he needed to kill himself or someone else to prevent his dad from trying to kill him. Mason had panicked and just wanted to get rid of Neil, which explains why he sounded so desperate to drop him off at my house earlier. After hearing this, I lost my mind and asked Mason why he would just dump Neil at my house without warning me, though I knew part of the fault was mine for not asking sooner. Later, it was revealed that Neil had taken drugs he shouldn't have, which triggered schizophrenic episodes and caused him to hear voices. About a month later, I told my mom the story, and she was not thrilled, to put it lightly. Needless to say, I avoided something truly horrific that night by being on edge when Neil entered the house. And I still think about what could have happened if I hadn't paid attention to him in the kitchen. I was 10 years old when this happened. My mom had gone grocery shopping that day, and she asked if I wanted to come. I remember making a big stink about not wanting to. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and I just wanted to stay home and shoot hoops in the street. I told her nothing bad would happen, and she would only be gone for a couple of hours. She finally gave in and let me stay as soon as she pulled out of the driveway. I grabbed the old basketball from the garage and started shooting around in the street where we had a hoop set up. I shot around for a while doing little games with myself, pretending I was down by 1 with a buzzer shot. I was sweating a little from running back and forth, and at one point I stopped to catch my breath. I bounced the ball lazily and looked around the neighborhood as I caught my breath. That's when I looked up toward the house. At the upstairs window, someone was staring down at me. It was only a shadow behind the glass at first, like someone was standing back from the sunlight. I stared for a good second or two before the shape shifted slightly, and I realized it wasn't some kind of trick from the sun. Someone was up there at the window looking out at the street. None of my family was supposed to be home. My sister was at college. My dad was at work. And my mom was across town buying groceries. I dropped the basketball without meaning to. The window was my sister's room. The blinds were half open, and the figure was right behind them. I say figure because that's all I saw. No distinguishable features that I didn't know what else to do except run inside and see who was home. I ran around the side of the house and through the backyard gate. I burst inside and slammed it shut behind me. I yelled up the stairs asking who was home. My voice cracked when I yelled it. For a second, I didn't hear anything. Then a voice answered from upstairs. It said, "Rad, come upstairs." It wasn't my mom. It wasn't my sister, and it wasn't my dad. It was deeper than any of their voices, but not deep like a grown man trying to sound scary. It sounded like someone trying to sound normal that I didn't go anywhere near the stairs. I ran straight through the house, grabbed the house phone off the kitchen counter, and sprinted back outside as fast as I could. I called my mom and told her someone was in the house, and she didn't believe me at first. She told me that's not something to joke about. She said she was almost done shopping, but I started basically crying into the phone, telling her I wasn't joking, telling her I heard someone call my name from inside, and there at the upstairs window. She finally believed me when I started sobbing and begging her to come home. She said she was leaving the store right now. After she hung up, she must have called the police because a cop car pulled up at the same time my mom's car turned into the driveway. She ran to me asking where I saw the person. I pointed to the upstairs window. The police went in first. My mom followed them inside after a minute or two. I waited out front. I didn't want to go back in there. For 10 minutes, I just stood there staring at the upstairs window. No one appeared at it again. Eventually, one of the officers came out and told me it was safe to come inside. I went in and pointed upstairs to the room where I saw the man. They checked the closets, under the bed, behind the dresser. They even checked the attic. They checked every room in the house. They didn't find anyone or anything. After the police left, my mom started acting doubtful again. She said she believed me, but I could tell she didn't fully. She said if she found out I was messing around, I'd be punished for scaring her and wasting the police's time. I kept telling her I wasn't lying. She kept saying she knew, but her voice said something else. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept thinking about the voice and that shadow behind the blinds, but eventually I got tired enough to drift off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was still dark out, and at first I thought I woke up from a bad dream. But then I heard something in my room just loud enough to wake me. I sat upright in my bed. My eyes were still adjusting to the dark, but I could see the outlines of my room. I could see my dresser, my closet door cracked open, my shelves, and across the room, not far from my bed, I saw something else. An unfamiliar shape. A tall, dark shape standing completely still, For a second, I thought I was imagining it, but then the slightest movement made me realize what it was. It was a person, a full-grown person standing in my bedroom. I didn't even have time to breathe. I just screamed, a loud, broken scream that tore out of my throat. As soon as I screamed, the figure moved fast. It darted across my room in 2 steps, grabbed my window, slid it open, and jumped out. I heard the man's feet land on the small awning below the window. My parents burst into the room as soon as I screamed. My dad ran straight to the window and looked out. Then he ran downstairs and out the back door to try to find whoever it was. I'm fairly certain he ran out there barefoot. He came back a few minutes later out of breath. He kept shaking his head and saying he didn't see anyone. They called the police again, but that time it was mostly just to file another incident report and for the cops to scout the area. We don't know how long he was in the house. All I know is he was inside during the day long enough to know my name, and he was watching me from my sister's window, and he stayed in the house until nightfall. That, or he snuck in and out of the house through my bedroom window by climbing up on that awning. Either way, he was in my room while I slept, standing there in the dark. Who knows what else he did while he was in the house? That's the scariest part. Every time I think about these experiences, I realize how important a sense of safety and awareness is. I was lucky that in every situation, with a little caution and help from others, I was able to keep myself safe. These terrifying moments, as confusing and painful as they were, taught me to always pay attention to my surroundings and never ignore the signs. Perhaps the most important lesson is that even when everything seems normal, being prepared and aware can make the difference between danger and safety.